So I enjoy reading historical fiction, but I never thought that I would. Years ago, um, I was working on a master's degree in history, in American military history specifically. And I remember my mom was reading historical fiction, and I was picking on her and giving her crap because she was reading bedtime stories and I was reading actual history. But I've totally changed my mind since then. And I actually love reading historical fiction when it's done really well. Stephen Pressfield writes amazing historical fiction. I read one of his books last year on vacation, and it's one of my favorites. It's called Man of War. And it's totally fictional about a Roman soldier in the first century. Here's the thing: historical fiction has to be about a fictional character. You have to make up a fictional character, and then you have the whole setting, you have the government, you have the country, you have the modes of travel, the weapons, the currency, everything about it. You're learning so much about that time period. So these authors have to do tremendous amounts of research. When you read his book called Gates of Fire, which is about the Battle of Thermopylae, by the end of this book, you feel like you have a master's degree in ancient Greek warfare and how their armies trained. But it's about a fictitious slave who is working in the Spartan army. You can't take historical fiction and make it about a real person, because now it's not really fiction. Now you're just lying about this person, right? It's a real guy who lived, but you're just making up a story about him. So that's very confusing. If you're thinking, well, no one would do that, sadly, you're wrong. I watched this movie a couple years ago when it came out with my family. It's called The Aeronauts. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's a pretty good movie. It's really entertaining. It's got a neat story. And it's all about, the movie is all about this this man and woman who break the world record for going up higher than anyone ever has in a balloon, in a hot air balloon. They break altitude records. So it's supposed to be a true story. It says like based on a true story, and it's this incredible movie. Well, when you look it up, when you Google it, as I did near the end of the movie, you realize, they changed a pretty important part of this movie. They took a man who was a historically real person who did this event, named Henry Coxwell, and he broke the world flight altitude record, and they replaced him in a movie with a woman named Amelia. Now think about that. It was an actual historical event by two men, James Glacier and Henry Coxwell, and they break a record. Years later, they make a movie about him, and they decide that it's going to be a movie where it's a man and a woman doing it. So they drop the character Henry Coxwell from the movie, replace him with a woman, Amelia, and make a movie. Well, that's not historical fiction anymore. That's just a lie, because Henry Coxwell probably has descendants who are very proud of, what their great-great-grandfather accomplished. And when they go to make a movie, they lie and tell you it was a woman named Amelia. Another silly example of doing this in historical fiction but using real characters is the movie Inglourious Bastards by Quentin Tarantino, right? It's actually got in the movie, it's got Hitler in the movie, and it's portraying Hitler getting killed in a movie theater. Like they're setting a movie theater on fire. It's this whole Allied operation that's all fictitious. But in it, they're showing a real character dying. Also, Abraham Lincoln was not a vampire hunter. So if you take real historical figures then you're not doing historical fiction anymore like Stephen Pressfield. You're just twisting what actually happened. You're changing the events. You're lying. This is what's called revisionist history. Revisionist history is when you take actual history and you revise it. Revisionist history is a very polite way of saying lying about history. Well, there's some revisionist history going on with America right now. And that's the record I want to set straight on today's mission brief. So I'm going to give you 3 fun facts about America. All right. Here's number 1. The founding fathers were almost all Christians. Now, if you're like me, you went to a secular university, you got, the random liberal arts degree, you've probably been told that most of the founding fathers were actually deists. This is for some reason a line that is continually being repeated. Most of the founding fathers were actually deists. And we hear this so often that we start to believe it. We hear it in school. We hear our kids say it because they learned it in school. It's in the movies. It's in the books. We're all just parroting this line. The problem is it's not correct. So check this out. I want to inform you guys of the actual facts. And what I'm going to read to you, we are linking this in the show notes, the article from Stand to Reason. So you don't need to write this down. You can go click on our show notes and get this article. And Greg Kokel's article that we're linking is actually citing Christianity and the Constitution by John Eidsmoe. Get this. Of the 55 founding fathers that were the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, 28 were Episcopalians, 8 were Presbyterians, 7 Congregationalists, 2 Lutherans, 2 Dutch Reformed, 2 Methodist, 2 Roman Catholics, 1 unknown, and only 3 were deists: Williamson, Wilson, and Franklin. So when it comes to the faith of our founding fathers, 51 of 55, that's 93%, were Christian. Fun fact there. Bet you didn't know that. Number 2, the phrase separation of church and state is nowhere in the Constitution. Again, we're told this so much. America has a separation of church and state. America has a separation of church and state. We have this separation of church and state. Where is that in the Constitution? It's not in there anywhere at all. In fact, the phrase separation of church and state comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut. They wrote him a letter, and they were concerned that the Connecticut Association was going to oppress their religious freedom. And he wrote this church group a letter back that said, you won't be bothered because in this country, we have a separation of church and state, meaning that the state cannot tell the church what to say. Fun fact, right? It's not in the Constitution. It's from a personal letter that he wrote reassuring a church that they would not be bothered by the government. But people don't know very much about our Constitution. And so, hey, they think that that phrase is in there. Fun fact number 3, America will only function if it is moral and religious. Interesting. Now, how do I say that? Where do I come up with this claim? Well, I'm coming up with this claim straight from John Adams. I want you to hear what John Adams had to say. He says, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So while our founding fathers were 93% Christian, they created a constitution that will work as long as the nation is moral and religious. So they set it up for any religion, right? You don't have to be a Christian. It will work for any religious, moral group of people. But as you know, you cannot have morality, an objective standard morality, without having an objective standard of good and evil, and that standard is God. If you're just now raising an eyebrow saying, huh? Go listen to Ambassador podcast number 4, where we go all in on that. It's called The Moral Argument for God. So John Adams said, you cannot have this country work. Our Constitution will only help govern a nation that is moral and religious. 93% of them were Christians. Only 3 were deists, and separation of church and state is nowhere in the Constitution. Those are your 3 fun facts. Don't be a part of this revisionist history that's trying to rewrite the characters that founded America like we're some sort of Quentin Tarantino movie. Hitler didn't die in a movie theater. There was not a woman in the hot air balloon that broke the altitude record. And the founding fathers of America were almost all Christians, and they created a country that will only work for moral and religious people.